Hello, everyone. So I wanted to continue with looking at some of my games and experiences in the Double Mujannah. Um, this is the a game that I played against Ricard Cuadra, who at this point in time is the strongest player in the world, um, maybe the strongest player of all time. At the time that this game was played, uh, I had been defeating him in our head-to-head matches, but uh, as those of you who follow the game know, that changed earlier this year due to some really deep preparation and just very serious study on Rickard's part. Um, and this game, it's one of the turning points in my uh, various battles, if you will, with Rickard. Double Mujannah, uh, when he played this against me with the black pieces, it was almost you could feel the kind of the laughter in his in his attitude when he played it because uh, as those of you who follow Rickard's games know, the Mujannah is a defense that he would just almost never adopt. He would consider it, beneath him sort of to play a double Mujannah because he would get so much better positions playing a Sheik against a Mujannah. And of course, I was very surprised when he played this. You can almost feel it a little bit if you look at the move order. We start off with a four pawns, and most of the games between myself and Record would start off with the four pawns, and one of us would play e4. But this game, when I went for the double Mujannah, he played g6, which is an interesting feint. It makes it look like he is going to play a seven pawns opening this way, or perhaps if not on this side, he's going to play a seven pawns out this side and start pushing on the king side. And when he played g6, I thought for sure he was going to be playing a four pawn or a seven pawns opening, maybe even an eight pawns opening. And so you can imagine my surprise. Okay, so now he has six pawns out. Clearly, he's going for seven pawns opening. I played knight to f3. You can imagine my surprise when Rickard played f5. Um, and he steers us towards a double Mujannah. I was shocked and a little bit perturbed because I had not expected our game to go this way. And as you'll see, though, even in a double Mujannah, Rickard's preparation and his skill and his sense for the game runs so deep. Even though this is not a part of his standard repertoire. So here, this is, if you'll notice, this is the same move order that I used against Phil Harris. And here I played 13b4. Now, the ancients probably would have considered b4 a slight inaccuracy, and they would have played rook to g1. And on this point, Alalaj and Asuli, I believe that they're right. White should play rook g1 immediately here. And if not rook g1, then h3 with the same idea. So you see an h3 Mujannah color center on chess.com is a big new proponent that we have in the community now who plays the h3 move rather than foregoing it and wasting a tempo on rook g1, rook g2. So color center often he'd be putting the rook on c2 and trying to blast with these pawns. So the pawn to h3 is certainly a way to play. Can't seem to get rid of this arrow. Okay, there we go. All right. So h3 is possible. Rook g1 is the move that the ancients would have played, and probably is what I would play if I had to take this position against Ricard again. But remembering my game with Phil Harris, I had very good luck just pushing this early. If you remember in that game, Phil conceded this point, and then played a6. And after a few moves on the Farzan side, waiting for black to play b5, I had the opportunity to play b5 myself. And in fact, I could just do it immediately, and I achieved a very good structure against this backward pawn. But Ricard's approach is quite different. Sensing that I've been slow to get this rook over, Ricard inserts the move h6. The point of this move is very subtle. So I played b5 here, and we'll get into that in a minute. But the idea with this, it's not an all-out attack on the Farzan side. As we saw in my game with Alec, an all-out attack gets nowhere, but it creates a subtle point. So if I play rook g1 immediately here, black goes ahead and plays g5. And the problem for white is, okay, so if I play rook g2, continuing along my merry way, black now has the opportunity to play g takes f4. If I take back this way, I'm dropping the rook. So I then have to capture away from the center. And this gives black a nice position with the two center pawns. And the pawn on f4 is likely at some point to become a liability. Black might play pawn to h5, bring an elephant out, target this pawn. Maybe knight to h5 at some point is in the cards. Black might also be able to at some point exchange, play d5, get an elephant out this way, or do something even like e5 to try to mobilize the center pawns. So the point of the move order with h6, and very subtle on Ricard's part, is that by committing myself to the pawn to b4 move early, I've lost the ability to play my rook over onto the Shah side without some consequence on the Farzan side or in the center. So, well, how did I deal with that? Well, realizing that I'd been slightly outfoxed on move order, I decided, well, the thing to do is I will go ahead and close up this side of the board, and then I'm going to recommit my firepower to the Farzan side, which is a bit of an interesting choice for me. I think part of it was spur of the moment. Another part of it was being unsure of how to react. As I mentioned in my very first lecture, where I talked about Al-Alaj's analysis, Al-Alaj assumes that if white is getting a pawn to b4, then black is going to be playing a6, exchanging, and trying to meet it with pawn to b5 on his own. So we're going to see carnage on the Shah side if white gets pawn to b4. Al-Alaj barely addresses at all the possibility that black is just going to sit on this structure and not do anything. And as I pointed out in my lecture, I think many modern players now would simply leave these two pawns in tension. There's no reason for black to concede anything. And there's also no reason for black to feel the need to seek out open lines and counterplay immediately on the Shah side. So faced with this, this is a very critical moment in the game for me. I could exchange. If I exchange and the pieces come off, we get to this structure. You know, black can even make the irony complete, play, you know, his knight to c6, and white can play pawn to h3, and we can have a completely symmetrical game. But you know, obviously white's given up any hope for the advantage here. I certainly didn't want that. You know, now I might be happy with, you know, just to play a simpler game with Ricard, and you know, if I happen to draw one, uh, you know, Ricard has always said, you know, Mujannah is just a draw at best for white. And you know, here, if I played Ricard again, I might be happy to just take that draw. And I have a feeling that he probably wouldn't play it against me now for that reason. Um, you know, at the time of this game, I was higher rated. I was pushing for a win. I had the white pieces. I had good momentum against him historically. So I had all kinds of reasons for trying to push for a win. But, you know, of course, b takes c5 is probably just going to lead to a draw. But in terms of other plans, it was possible here for me to play something like bringing the first hand to f2. And the idea here would just be to switch it up. I would go e4 and bring the first hand to e3. And the idea here is just to create multiple fronts, multiple pawn breaks in the center. And if I had to play this position again, maybe I would opt for that, well, assuming that I want to win and I wouldn't be content for a draw. Something just like first hand f2, entirely playable. You know, and also the point being, okay, if black gets this break in, so what? I'm not afraid of this in any way. If I have these pawns in a line with a first hand, there's no way that black is going to be able to crack this, as I've shown in plenty of other lectures. So there's not really a whole lot of point. Probably black plays this anyway because what else? Or maybe black, you know, would swing a rook around, or even try to create some play in the center of its own. But of course, playing a move like e5 has risks as well. Particularly here, you know, black probably can't play something like e5 because of the tension that always exists between these two pawns. White would be free to take, and then after the exchange, gobble the pawn on c5, exchange off rooks. This knight gets lured away from the center, and so the pawn falls. So, you know, really, white's best approach here, if I had to do this again, probably something like just bring the first hand to f2. It's not as flashy as having this rook on the shah side, but it is fairly calm strategic play with bringing another pawn into e4, creating just trying to create a nice stable situation in the center where white has all of the options for pawn breaks. But instead of pursuing any of those plans, you know, with white, I think I acted a little bit rashly here, realizing that I'd been outfoxed, and I played pawn to b5. So at first blush, it looks like this is a great move. White's seizing a lot of space on the shah side. Eventually, for instance, so if black plays knight to e7 here, if white plays for this pawn break, you notice that this structure is not the same color as the first hand. So the first hand can't magically jump in to c7, where it would perform defensive duties on this structure. So it looks like white is gearing up for an eventual pawn break on the A file and maybe dominating that side of the board. In reality, what happens though, if white plays b5 in these structures, okay, black played knight to a5. They say a knight on the rim is dim, but this is a much better move than it might look at first blush. black has the idea of playing pawn to e5 eventually, bringing an elephant out here and creating sacrificial opportunities on the c4 square. Black also has the idea of a6 at some point, exchanging on b5 if white takes with the knight or the rook, then this elephant can jump out to a6. And of course, if white takes c takes b5, we're moving away from the center, and that's going to clear a route for black to come in and use these squares in the center. So strategically, this is not as nice for white as it looks. Of course, that being said, the position is certainly not worse for white, and there's still a long way to go before white loses this game. But if I had to play this again, playing pawn to b5 is probably not the option I would pick. So black plays knight to a5. Here I played rook to g1. And you can see exactly what my plan is. Black played pawn to g5. Now I played pawn to h3, and my idea is I am going to try to open up the Ferzan side by exchanging pawns and playing pawn to g4. In my line of thought when I came up with this plan, I thought I was being very clever because even though black may have a couple of extra tempi on this side of the board, I thought, well, this knight on a5 is sidelined, and since it's sidelined, that is going to give me a superior position when I eventually swing the rook over and play something like knight to e2. I'm going to have more pieces on the Ferzan side. So that's my idea. Black plays rook to b7. Of course, all of the play now is going to be either in the center or on the Ferzan side, which is unusual for a double Mujannah, but that's how the cookie crumbled because we've locked up the Shah side. Rook to b2 on my part, and then king to c7. This is actually a very, very interesting move from Ricard. I don't know that he would play this again because the king actually ends up being very far away from the action. He's trying to castle by hand. He's building a fortress, and it makes sense to some extent because this side of the board is completely locked. His king will be very, very safe, but as we'll see in later lines, the king actually serves a very important purpose, and when all of the pieces are traded off, the king needs to be able to run out to the Ferzan side in the endgame. So somewhat inaccurate move, and I don't think that Ricard would play it again. You can tell he thought a long time on it. 30 seconds is a pretty long time in a 5-minute game. My guess is that if we were to play this game again, he'd probably play rook on b to g7 or something similar. King to c7. I played rook on b to g2, which is definitely an inaccuracy. And the reason that it's an inaccuracy is that since I'm going to be playing this structure anyway, and trying to open up the F file, probably I'm just going to be better off either playing it immediately or playing rook to f2 first instead. And particularly with a king on c7, I have a little bit of extra time because black's rook is impeded. So I should probably go ahead and make this exchange and play pawn to g4. The idea here being, okay, black takes, white takes, black plays king to b7. Here I can either play rook to f2, or I can swing all the way over to h2. Rook to f2 looks good to me. I'm threatening this knight, and this means that I have discovered opportunities with knight takes g5. Black probably has to play rook to f7 to defend against those. And here, this pawn being a weakness, maybe now would be an appropriate time to play pawn to e4. And the idea here is simple. I'm going to run this elephant up to e3, and I'm going to have some opportunities on the g5 square. Maybe black would end up playing something like this in order to counter it with his own elephant, bringing it up. But overall, I think that I've achieved something here in that I am the one leading the fight, so to speak. I'm up a tempo, and this knight on a5 is a little bit sidelined. So probably I would just go ahead and play bishop to e3 here, continue with this attack. And particularly since my knight takes g5 is going to be hitting this rook on f7, black has a little bit of trouble defending against this. So I think you can see the king maneuver for black has lost some time that would be very, very valuable in this structure. And so this is sort of played into my hands. Unfortunately for me, I played rook on b to g2 first, which ultimately ends up losing time. And black has time. Now he's able to connect the rooks again, which meant that when I exchanged and played pawn to g4, now black was able to simply continue. F takes g4, takes, and then rook f7. And suddenly black is the one who has made these discovered threats. Black is the one who is up a tempo in this fight for the Fursian side. And this is where I really start to go wrong. I played a move that's very natural, which is king to e2. But the reason that this is bad is that actually there's sort of an intricate dance going on here between the knight on a5 and the king on d1, which I was completely oblivious to, but Ricard, of course, knew all about. So when I played king to e2, this does defend the knight on f3, but as you probably noticed, if you've ever played king to e2, this bishop coming out to g4 is going to hit it with check. Black followed up with pawn to e5 in order to carry out this threat. I said, well, you know, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. I'll go ahead and do the same thing. But now I have critically weakened the d4 square. And it was a real head slapper of a moment when Ricard played knight to b3. Taking advantage of this, his knight on a5, which was completely sidelined, is now headed to the deadly d4 square. And at this moment, white is worse, and I have all of the psychological baggage then that goes with having to defend a worse position against someone who's clearly outplayed me. So, you know, what was the correct thing for me to do? Well, I should just concede that bringing the rook to g2 was a waste of time. The move rook to f2 would have been fine. You know, you can debate it for hours, but it's actually hard to find a move for black that's better than just king to c7, which would show that the entire king maneuver was ill-conceived. Here, in order to keep an eye on b3, I could just put my king on c2. And again, it's hard to figure out exactly what moves make progress for either side. If black plays something like a6, I can play a4, knight d7, maybe with the idea of putting the knight here at some point. Again, these are not necessarily the best moves, but there's some moves I can just meet it with e4, and now I'm jumping in. I'm putting pressure on g5, rook here. I mean, this, if we got this far, I think this is better for white because I've managed to surround the g5 pawn. Possibly instead of king to c7, maybe black has to play this. And and the game just proceeds this way. If if black puts his elephant on the e6 square, these two pawns both come under attack, and you can kind of see the weakness of the structure with me having put the pawn on b5. The knight is going to be attacking this pawn. So I'd have to play something resourceful and creative here in order to keep my position together. There probably are some opportunities. A little bit difficult to see what they are even looking at it because you know, I've already started to lose the thread of the position, and when you get into one of these wars over the tension between the two pawns, it's usually not good to be the one moving second and being the second mover when it comes to this pressure. So definitely a struggle here for white. I, I do think the route that I went with king e2, though, is worse for me than had I just defended with rook to f2. Pawn to e5 comes. Tough moment. Bishop's coming here. We're going to have a double threat. There might be precise moves for white, but I haven't found them. So e4, knight to b3. I just brought my bishop in, and Ricard centralizes his knight. I end up just having to concede this fork. It's not good for white because black is able to get away with bringing his pawn towards the center. He doesn't even have to give up an e-pawn for this elephant. He's giving up the c-pawn, which is really a pawn that you typically do want to trade for an elephant. So knight to d5. There's just an exchange here. I could maybe capture this way, but I am opening up myself along the c file now, and with a king on e2, it's not necessarily a great place to be. I thought e takes d5 gave me some better chances. I'm hoping to run the king into e4 and just hold. And I think I'm correct on that. So black took on e3, white takes on e3, rook to h8. Makes sense. Black is up a little bit of material here and is really hammering down on the F and H files. Rook to f2, I've got to do something to try to relieve this pressure. Rook to f4, very good move, just making it as unpleasant as possible. I went ahead and exchanged, Ricard captured towards the center. I played king to f2. I think in hindsight, probably the right plan here for white had to be king to e4. I was already crumbling down on the clock, but if white wants to hold this, the idea is almost certainly going to be jam the king into f5 and try to run the g-pawn. And as we'll see, this isn't as hopeless for white as it looks, particularly with the king being all the way over on b8. So king to e4 maybe is the right plan. we'll see, though, I haven't lost yet. Rook to h2 check. I tried to exchange off. What I'm hoping to do is go for a drawing position where if black were to oblige me and exchange off these rooks, I would sink my king into e4, get that king into f5, hopefully, and the hope for white would be that I could just sit this out. I'm down material, but there's no good way for black to break through on the shah side, and black's king is so far away from the Ferzan side that it's going to take a very long time for him to get any kind of anything to drive me out orchestrated. So just to kind of give you a sample of what could happen, so king to c7, you know, I'm coming in, and in this position, white either has very good drawing chances, or maybe he just has a draw, because it's going to be very difficult for black to make progress. White is going to just go back and forth basically with his king. Maybe it's correct to run the g pawn down first, but it's hard to see what black can actually do if I'm playing this way. Black can maybe get a Ferzan in to g6 just to try to stop my king from going back and forth. But if I'm not able to tempo with the king, you know, certainly I can do so with a Ferzan. I can even hop this elephant in, and it's hard to see with the two elephants exactly what it is that black's going to be able to do to break through this barricade. So for this reason, we see some of the weakness for black of having the king certainly very safe, but also very far away from the action. So Ricard very wisely doesn't exchange rooks. He decides to drop back to h7. And here I played king to f3, and this is probably the last move of the game where I actually have a chance to draw. King to f3 shows that I've cracked, and just so that you see it, when I play king to f3, now Ricard is able to play rook to h1. This forces my king back to f2. Now I've lost too much time, and black will start to come through on this side. I'll show you what happened. I tried to run my g-pawn down, black blocked it, so I'm not going anywhere there, and now black has all the time in the world. I don't know what I'm doing here. I'm just self-destructing, basically. But as you see now, black has all the time in the world to activate his king, and this is the end of the game. But it's you know largely just me being defeated. So I'll show you though the last opportunity that I have to stay in this game and hopefully make a draw. And I'll tell you, when I played king to f3, I thought I was probably lost, and I thought the only thing that was going to save me was getting the king into f5, and that's probably true. But this is an inaccurate move order since black is able to get the rook into h1. So I have to play pawn to g5 here. And the idea is, okay, if the Ferzan comes here to try to stop it, I'm in time. I play g6. So there's not a good way to stop the pawn from coming into g6. Black should try to activate his king. Now I'd play pawn to g6, force rook g7. And now I start my king walk, magical king walk up to f5. So king to d8. I bring the king to e5 to f5 now. And in this position, it's remarkably hard for black to make any progress. And I think that white probably has achieved a draw, or at least a drawing position. So, for instance, Fursan to f7, of course, to put pressure on the g6 pawn. All white has to do is tempo with a move like rook to g5. Black isn't breaking anything open on the shah side. These pawns in the center are all frozen. The elephant, if it tries to run out this way, then let's say that maybe black did play pawn to f3 and then get an elephant in to f4. Doesn't really do anything, and white's going to be able to round up this f3 pawn, and in that case actually not be down material. And of course, the sacrifice like this, there's not any kind of clear way for black to break through here. So believe it or not, I do actually have a chance then probably to go ahead and create a drawing fortress by playing pawn to g5. Not something I saw in the game, and this inaccuracy allowed black then to get a winning position, essentially blocking this pawn in so that it would always be a weakness that black could surround, and black's always going to now, if the rooks come off, be able to bring his Fursan in and have the e4 break.